For this talk about peace, let's do something a little bit different. How about we stop trying to make peace for a moment, and let me tell you more about this. Because for all the erudition that seems to come from the work that's currently being done in international peace and security, civil society, academia, research institutions, we're sometimes confronted with moments of such abject and utter failure. I'm talking about, for instance, the image of the small boy who was trying to flee the war in Turkey and ended up washed ashore, the war in Syria and ended up washed ashore on the beaches of Turkey. Or in 2013, when we first started receiving images of people who had been killed by chemical weapons in Syria. I'm using these images right at the outset to sort of remind ourselves why we are here in the first place. The reason I'm saying this is because I've worked for the OPCW. I've spent my international career working among people who are in international peace and security. I worked with the United Nations before as an analyst, but I'm here today not as a representative of these organizations, but to tell you about my own personal beliefs. What is it that drives me to work in the area of peace? Is peace an act of philanthropy? Why are any of us here? We are here because of that boy. We are here because of these horrific moments of failure, because of which we cannot just return to our regular lives and our daily jobs. And it doesn't matter if we are politicians or lawyers or engineers or students of international relations. The reason that peace is something that is our personal responsibility is not because it's an act of philanthropy. It's because every single day in our daily jobs, we create and sustain a world, no matter what sector we are in, that allows the killing of innocent men and women and children. I think it's a little bit flimsy to appeal to the international community and say, oh, we must build peace because of something grandiose like our common humanity, or what's that other favorite? Goodwill towards our fellow man. No, the reason we need to take responsibility is because we created this mess. And I'm directing this specifically to the people who are in the business of international peace and security now. I think we have spent far too long in conference rooms talking to people among the converted when we should be taking this business a little bit more seriously. Stop hiding behind the convenient cynicism that tells us that war is natural or eternal, and stop hiding behind the cowardice that comes with saying, oh, these conflicts are so intractable. Each one of them is a different story. Each one of them is motivated by different factors, so there's absolutely nothing we can do to prevent it or stop it from happening. This is why I have a problem with the word peace. And so I'm here to propose to you that we stop trying to make peace, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes making a case for declaring war against war. You have to realize that the project of war is brutally efficient. It is effective, it is efficient, it is Machiavellian in nature. And if the project of peace is going to stand up to something as formidable as that, it has to be just as Machiavellian. So I'm proposing we do this in two ways. Number one, we start perhaps considering armed conflict one issue. You know, the same way we do HIV/AIDS or malaria or poverty or human trafficking. Those are also deeply contextual. They come from the certain, a particular city or the country from which they emerge. But at the same time, we do frame them as single issues. And I'm going to explain more why we should do that. And once we've done that, we can perhaps start looking at more objective, rational strategies to drive the industry of war out of business. So first things first. We know this for a fact. I mean, we've just heard about big data. We know that, for example, economic interests in one part of a continent can mine blood diamonds in another. We know that local geostrategic interests can be closely tied to alliances that are forged thousands of miles away. We know that the manufacture of arms in one part of the world influences the breakouts of civil war in another. And yet the international community continuously looks at conflict on a case-by-case basis and not as a single issue. Why we should start doing that, and of course with a lot of nuance and contextualization, why we should start doing that is because as with human trafficking or HIV or malaria, what this helps us do intellectually is start seeing the interlinkages between these problems. And what it helps us in policy making is to operationalize new ways of cooperation. It shows us that, for example, only the organizations that have the word peace and security in their names, they are not the only ones who have a stake in this and are responsible for this. But across the different sectors of development and security, we have a stake. Also, when we start looking at it as a single issue, we suddenly see really alarming numbers. For instance, 1,776 billion US dollars. That's how much the world's annual military expenditure is. There was another interesting statistic from the Institute of Economics and Peace that tells us that the world is spending $14 trillion on violence, so losing $14 trillion to violence. If we could cut down on, that's 13%, by the way, of the global GDP. If we could cut down on global violence by even just 10%, that would leave us with a saving and a generation of $1.4 trillion, which is 10 times more than all of the foreign aid that is currently flowing from wealthy countries to the developing world. Now, the reason that I'm not talking to you about the human toll of conflict is because it's not admissible. I mean, you can't make a case for peace by saying that people die. I mean, sorry, if it was as simple as that, we would have outlawed conflict centuries ago. The failure of the peacekeeping community repeatedly seems to be that we are appealing to the moral conscience of people. You know, in more conferences like these, we should do more, we should... There is a logical flaw to doing that because war is not a moral problem. It doesn't emerge from moral failure, it emerges from vested interest, it emerges from perceived benefit. And therefore, this is a terrible peacekeeping strategy. I, as much as the next person, would enjoy sitting in conference rooms, as many, peace and youth conferences do around the world, hold hands, sing John Lennon's Imagine. But not only is there an aesthetic problem with doing that, it's just logically flawed. War is not a moral problem, it is a global enterprise that employs thousands of people. It generates hundreds of billions of dollars that accrue its benefits to those who are at the helm of affairs. So once we recognize it as being that, how do we drive it out of business? Let's use a simple economic model. Let's take any industry, for example, cell phones. We have cell phones. We have an industry of cell phones for 3 reasons. 1, somebody wants them, so there's a demand in the market. Somebody's making cell phones, so there is supply. And there are no reasonable alternatives to using mobile phones. So how do you drive any industry out of business? You destroy demand, destroy supply, and create alternatives. And that is a more strategic way. So how does the war on war, let me begin at the beginning, how does it destroy demand? There is a huge volume of incredible work being done on data analytics and global mapping of conflicts that helps us understand the motivations of actors on the ground, helps us understand the variables that fuel conflict. I'm proposing that we link this huge body of work that is currently being done in think tanks and research institutions and universities and link it more closely as policy advice to international organizations in global governance and multilateral governance, which are actually working in peace and security issues. Because what this helps us do is understand where demand comes from. So for example, if it comes from resources, if people want more political power or more economic benefits, then we have to address the demand for war at the level of the developmental discourse. If development policy, which is being run by a whole different set of organizations, by the way, is more cognizant of equity, it's more cognizant of giving people a stake in their future, then it's that much less likely that leaders of ethnic groups or religious groups will be able to generate a demand for conflict among those people. So the war on war will not just be waged in ministries of defense, it will be waged in ministries of finance, in banks, in development institutions, in aid financing organizations. When demand is generated because somebody has manufactured an enemy based on something as superficial as, for example, identity or ethnicity or religion, then we need interventions in free press, in independent journalism, in our classrooms, in making sure our curriculums teach students to think critically. And so the war on war then will be waged on the internet, on the pages of newspapers, in universities. A little bit of a note about prevention here. When I talk about the demand for war, what we're really doing by strategically intervening here is try to prevent it from breaking out. One of the biggest gaps in the peacekeeping community so far has been that our actions seem to be focused on responding to conflicts, which is, how can we seriously be in this business if our actions focus on war after it has already broken out or after people have already died? So we need to stop being so cautious about prevention and using data to help us identify where these problems are about to occur and then stop them from happening, or at least try. Coming to supply. The supply of war lies in its weapons. We already have this alarming figure of almost $1,800 billion being spent on military expenditures worldwide. But we also live in a world where there are around 900 million small arms in circulation around the world. And for some strange reason, we are sitting on almost 16,000 dormant nuclear warheads. Disarmament is so critical because not only does it eliminate an entire category of weapons, it also eliminates the chance of an entire type of war. I'm going to talk a little bit about the OPCW here, where I currently work. In a short 2 decades, it has been able to successfully verify the destruction of over 90% of all chemical weapons worldwide. Almost every UN member state now subscribes to this global ban. What in effect this has done is not just reduce the numbers of chemical weapons around the world, it has actually really reduced the possibility of chemical conflicts and chemical warfare itself. So you can see, you eliminate the supply of something, you automatically eliminate that form of violence from breaking out. And finally, creating alternatives. Creating alternatives means finding ways to channel disputes and conflicts into solutions so that they don't break into armed violence. We do this at the international level by strengthening the responsibility to protect. So a peacekeeping force, which is more legitimate and accountable, to maintain a ceasefire or to maintain law and order where the only alternative would be for 2 parties to go to war against each other. We do this at the national level by making sure our justice system, so investing more in faster and more accountable legal processes so that people don't feel wronged. We do this by creating more creative forms of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. We have to use the same places from which violence sometimes stems, social institutions, religious institutions, and so the war on war is going to be waged not just by people in uniforms, but in our churches and in our temples and in our courtrooms. Before I conclude, I'm going to draw your attention to something which is really quite remarkable. This generation, more than any other generation in history, has inherited a unique opportunity. We live in a Westphalian world. We have institutions of global governance and the power of globalization on our side. We have a head start on international law, on disarmament treaties, on channels of cooperation that already exist. So we can no longer sit around and make excuses for why the project of peace keeps failing and why the distressing image of, for example, a boy who had no stake in a conflict has died and been washed ashore the beaches of Turkey. So what I'm proposing to you here today is that we stop making those excuses, and I'm going to actually leave you with a quote from Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, and he was a military strategist, but he had something very important to tell us about our business, which is that what is necessary in war is victory, not prolonged operations. So let's not make a career out of being in the field of peace. It's a great place to work, but let's remember why we are here. It's not because we want better jobs or more glory for ourselves, but it's to stop horrific moments from occurring. So I think it's time now to fight for that boy and to turn our comfortable conference rooms into war rooms where we can really strategize about what can actually be done on the ground to change things. And it's time probably to declare war on war. Thank you.